Okay, good evening, MOCA friends. I'm Neil Gibbs, Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives at the Museum of Chinese America. We hope you are feeling safe and taking good care of yourself and your loved one. MOCA proudly presents Virtual MOCA Fest 2022, the museum's annual celebration of the Lunar New Year. Yes, we're still celebrating Lunar New Year, and this is our last week of Lunar New Year programming. This evening, MOCA is thrilled to have you join us virtually to hear from historian Mae Ngai as she discusses her latest book, The Chinese Question, The Gold Rushes and Global Politics, with Beth Lew-Williams, Associate Professor of History at Princeton University. If you enjoy this public program, we hope you'll consider making a gift to become part of a continuing lifeline for MOCA. No amount is too little, and we greatly appreciate your generosity. Your contribution helps sustain our beloved institution and supports the creation of new online programming that will bring comfort and inspiration to more communities. Lastly, this program is brought to you by MOCA friends and partners, including Bloomberg Philanthropies. This program is also supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. Without further ado, I will let our moderator Herb to introduce our guests, Mae and Beth. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, and thank you all for tuning in tonight. Apologies about my dark kind of background. Yeah, apologies about how dark I am, but just bear with me. I'm not really the focus anyway, so I'll say my piece and then go dark. But I just want to say I've been really looking forward to this conversation about Mae's newish book, The Chinese Question, The Gold Rushes and Global Politics, between two of the great scholars working in Chinese, Asian American, and immigration history, Mae Ngai and Beth Lew-Williams. So thank you both for being with us. It's really an honor for us to host this with you. The talk is in conjunction with our current exhibition titled Responses, Asian American Voices, Resisting the Tides of Racism, which explores the roots of anti-Asian racism and hopefully creates space for visitors to reflect and respond to the discrimination and violence our communities are facing today. We know that this talk comes at a time when there is a lot of confusion and fear in the Asian American community about some of the violent attacks that have happened on streets and spaces that we once thought were safe. And one of the great aspects to me of Mae's book is how it really centers the actions and intentions of individuals who found themselves in an environment that was often hostile to their presence, and then framing it through very intersectional lenses. So there are a lot of lessons in the book for our current moment. And so with that, I won't take up any more of your time except to give Mae and Beth a proper intro. So if you can indulge me, Mae Ngai is the Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and Professor of History and co-director of the Center for Study of Ethnicity and Race. She is a US legal and political historian interested in the histories of immigration, citizenship, nationalism, and the Chinese diaspora. She's the author of the award-winning Impossible Subjects, Illegal Aliens, and the Making of Modern America, The Lucky Ones, One Family, and The Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America, and of course, The Chinese Question. She's written on immigration history and policy for papers like the Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, The Atlantic, The Nation, and Dissent. And she's now working on another book called Nation of the Immigrants, A Short History of an Idea, which we're all looking forward to. And then Beth Lew-Williams, Associate Professor of History at Princeton University. She's a historian of race and migration in the United States, specializing in Asian American history. And her book, The Chinese Must Go, Violence, Exclusion, and the Making of the Alien in America, won the Ray Allen Billington Prize and the Ellis Halley Prize from the Organization of American Historians, and with support from the NEH, National Endowment for Humanities. Her next book, Project on John Doe Chinaman, will consider the policing of Chinese migrants in the American West. And then the last thing I'll say is that if you have questions, which I'm sure you will during the talk with Mae and Beth, please type them into the Q&A box, and we will make sure to get to them at the end of the program. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to Beth Lew-Williams to begin the discussion. Beth.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be in conversation with Mae Ngai about her new book. It's too bad that this is virtual and you can't all, come and get your copy as part of this. But I really recommend this book. It's a book that's really, I think, one of the things that's so striking about it is that it's really remarkable in its scope. I think, an audience for MOCA, my guess is that a lot of you have some familiarity about, Chinese immigration, Chinese in the California gold rush, maybe a little bit about Chinese exclusion in the United States in general, which are topics that US historians and documentarians and novelists and increasingly, authors of all sorts have started paying a lot of attention to. What Mae does in this book is she looks at how these sort of US-based histories connect to other key locations around the globe. And so the Chinese question doesn't just follow Chinese migrants on the search for gold in the United States, in California, it also goes to Australia and to South Africa. And what it does in the process is it tells this astonishing story of migration and adaptation and perseverance on the part of Chinese miners. And then sort of the confluence, but also the divergence in anti-Chinese sentiment in all of these locations and the laws that follow, the exclusion laws in various sites. And I think it's really remarkable that she tells this global history without losing the stories of individual people, in particular individual Chinese migrants. So I was hoping we could start out, Mae, with you giving us a little sense of the origin story of this book. How did you get to this topic? How did this book come about?
Thank you. Well, first, I want to thank MOCA for organizing this, and especially Beth for agreeing to be a discussant today. And thank you for that very nice summary of the book. So, right, how did the book start? Well, as with many things, it started as a response to a student of mine who was writing a paper about California politics in the 19th century. And the student wrote that Chinese workers in California were coolies. That is, that they were indentured workers who were like slaves. And I knew that wasn't true, but I found it very difficult to correct him because that myth, the coulee myth, had been deeply embedded in the historical literature. It's been the predominant theory since the 1960s. And it was something based on what I consider to be a bad use of sources. And then it was repeated over and over again by subsequent scholars. And why is the coulee myth important? Well, it was important because likening Chinese to slaves painted the Chinese as a servile race, having no humanity or individuality or agency, hopelessly unable to understand or practice democracy. So it was the basic rationale for the exclusion laws. So I started the book with the goal to slay the coulee myth. And that was both an empirical challenge and a question of political analysis. But then it grew into a larger story and argument about the contours of Chinese immigrant experience in the US and in the British settler colonies and the evolution of a global race theory.
Yeah, maybe you could talk a little bit about the variations in that myth, because I think going back to sort of the scope of this book, one of the things that this allows us to do is to compare sort of what are the racial stereotypes, in California in the 19th century, as opposed to Australia, or later at the turn of the century in South Africa. So do you find this coulee myth in all of these locations? Does it look the same? Does it do the same work, in these various places?
Well, yes and no. So the coulee myth was ubiquitous in California starting in the 1850s. It was, theorized, it was weaponized by politicians. So it was a very kind of well-developed racial theory in the United States, especially on the West Coast. And when I started researching it in Australia, I was kind of surprised that I didn't see the same language on the gold fields. The Chinese question in Australia was much more inchoate. There was suspicion, and there was arguing and fighting between whites and Chinese, but they didn't develop a theory about them. They thought they wasted water. They criticized them that they were heathens. And they said that, they just, and what they were really afraid of in Australia was not that they were contracted or coolies, but actually the fact that they were not. The fact that they were voluntary immigrants is what frightened them, because they thought that then there would be unlimited numbers of Chinese coming, because who would stop them, right? Unlimited numbers of Chinese coming. And that really sparked an anxiety that Australians had about being at the very, very fringes of the British Empire in Asia, close to China's proximate millions. So during the gold rush in Australia in the 1850s, they did not speak of Chinese as coolies. But later in the 1880s, it appears, and it appears almost imported whole from California. And it's imported by working men's movements in the cities, where there are very few Chinese in Australia in the cities. And yet they are repeating the coolie myth that they're reading about in the newspapers from California, because there's a movement at this time now in Australia called the White Australia movement. And the Chinese become a foil for their own racism and their own nationalism.
What do you take from this variation? So the divergence, but then also the convergence. I ask this partially as, it's always, it's challenging, I think, to teach today's students about race and racism, in part, I find, because it feels so inevitable and forever, sort of the white supremacy that they're learning to identify in their everyday life. So what do you take from this variation and the change that you're seeing in the 19th century?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what I was hoping to achieve with this history, which is to say that racism, as you suggest, is not some generalized human condition, right? Human beings are not born to be suspicious of people who don't look like them. They have to learn that from something, and even if they are, kind of ethnocentric or something, it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be violent towards people who are not like them, right? So these are, I feel, political issues and historical issues. And I often think about the late cultural theorist Stuart Hall, the British theorist, and he said there's no such thing as racism. There are racisms. And racism is always historically and politically specific. So we understand that, and then we can understand what drives it today, which I think is a combination of through lines, or legacies from the past, but also reproduction in today's context, right? What was generative 100 years ago is not necessarily convincing today. So it has to be reproduced to be meaningful today. But if we understand those things, then maybe we have a hope to oppose it through political organizing and opposition. So that's, I think, the biggest takeaway I feel in my book, is to show that racism is always historical, it's always specific, and then there's always the possibility of resistance against it.
Yeah, I think the book really captures that. I think one of the questions I wanted to ask you about was, because a lot of what you do in this book is talk about anti-Chinese politics, so not just this myth and the stereotype, but how that stereotype feeds political action, and then how that political action sometimes turns violent. This is a topic have written about as well, and I'm interested in. So I'm curious to hear you talk about, the relationship between politics and violence. So how do these two things together work to create the hostile environments that many Chinese miners encountered? Or another way to put, or when do you see that politics turn violent? Or I'm just curious to hear you talk about the relationship between those two.
Right. Yeah, I think that both in California and in Australia, the gold rushes take place on frontiers. And so they're both not in settled areas, and they're these big international contact zones. And in California in particular, the rule of law is very weak. In Australia, that's not the case. In Australia, there is more a heavier hand from the colonial government over the gold fields. But nonetheless, in both places, the gold fields are in frontier areas. So there's a kind of lawlessness. And they're also very competitive environments, right? People are very aggressive because they're trying to, make their fortune. And it becomes very clear very quickly that not everybody's going to get rich, right? A lot of people don't make money on the gold fields. So I think these are conditions that feed violence, but it's also not all violence all the time. People in the gold fields also worked with each other. They had disputes, they argued. So it's not always violent. But I think, the kind of when racism becomes weaponized in politics, right? What I call the nativist playbook is something like this, right? So there are people who are aggrieved, like they're unemployed, or they feel their futures are precarious for whatever reason. On the gold field, just when the easy stuff is gone and people are worried about being able to mine enough gold to make a good living. So you start with it, there's some kind of grievance in the population. And then you have pundits or intellectuals, who create a theory of racial difference to appeal to that grievance and to say, this is why you have a problem. It's because these people here are responsible. And then that theory gets weaponized by politicians who use it to get people to vote for them, right? And to otherwise rally, so that they don't look at the real reasons for their economic precarity. They look to a scapegoat. And so I think that that's what happened in California, where you really have large-scale violence is when you have this weaponization of racism by politicians. And then they can't control it. Right. So a lot of the riots that you talk about, Beth, in your book that happened, actually, they happened in the 1880s after the exclusion laws passed. That's really interesting. And it's as though the exclusion law justified their racism, right, and gave them license to say, it's not enough just to restrict people coming in. We want to get rid of everybody, right? And so you have this a whole slew of driving out campaigns and people burning down towns. So I think that, I think that it's something that's set off by politics at a certain kind of moment. The same thing was true in Australia. There were riots. People tried to destroy Chinese miners' encampments. They burned their tents, murdered people. It was terrible. Interestingly, in South Africa, you didn't have the same kind of violence because the Chinese were like industrial mine workers. They lived in separate compounds and they worked in these deep mines. And so you didn't have kind of mob violence against them. It was more that they created a lot of problems on the mines by like refusing to work and stuff like this.
Yeah. Well, maybe that segues, I've been focusing so much asking about the racism, about the myth, about the sort of politics and the law, but really, I think in many ways, the center of this book is the Chinese miners themselves, right? So You want to talk a little bit about your process trying to recover those stories? Because it's very difficult to do, as I know. How did you manage to tell these individual stories? What kind of sources did you turn to try to give a sense to your reader what it would have been to live in this environment?
Right. Well, as I've been saying, I went through thousands of haystacks and collected thousands of little needles and then tried to stitch together a picture. Some individuals were easier to research than others. There were people who were leaders in the community or people who were associated with the Qing government who were, their consuls stationed abroad. And they have written, they published things or they wrote journals. So those people are easier to find sources for. But the ordinary gold miner, the regular person, is very hard to find, especially in any kind of sustained way. So, I looked at court records, transcripts of inquest hearings. I read about them in the words of other people, so that you always have to take with a grain of salt, obviously, because it's a third party that's talking about them, but you can learn from those things too. And some of it's just statistical, like in South Africa, the government or the government agency responsible for the mine program, they kept data on how many people refused to work, how many people were convicted of deserting. I found that maybe upwards of a third of the people who were, so about 60,000 Chinese worked in South Africa in the first decade of the century. And of those 60,000, there were 20,000 who were convicted of everything from refusing to work, desertion, also violent crimes, like assault, even manslaughter. Sometimes they would desert the mines and then they would go out in the countryside and attack a farm, to get food, right? I don't condone it. I'm collecting the data, right? So there is, so you say, wow, 20,000 out of 60,000 were convicted of something. That's actually that's a big number. And most of the way people resisted was not even necessarily in conviction data, but there was a lot of data that showed that in South Africa they had to drill with a hand drill. They had to drill so many inches a day minimum to get paid. And despite whippings and withholding food, they just refused to drill more than the minimum. They got a bonus if they drilled more, and they were like, why bother? It's really hard drilling into a rock face. So there was all kinds of resistance, even though I didn't, the data, their names that are placed in them, but it was very hard to know much about those people's lives. But you kind of end up with a composite picture.
Yeah, maybe since you just brought up South Africa, you could tell our listeners or watchers a little bit more about that story, because I think of all the stories you tell, perhaps that's the least known.
Yeah, right.
How do we end up with Chinese miners in South Africa?
So gold mining in South Africa is different than in California and Australia. First of all, it's highly industrial. It's very deep mining, 2,000 feet, highly capitalized, with investors from both locally and from Europe. So it's big business, and it really kind of took off in the 1890s. But then there was a South African war in the beginning few years of the 20th century between the British and the so-called Boers, right, or the Dutch descended people. And so during that war, mining came to a standstill. And so after the war, like in 1903, the mine companies, or what we call the landlords, right, wanted to get the mines back up and running. And they had a lot of trouble recruiting native African labor that had historically done the unskilled work in the mines, because they had cut wages, the blacks didn't want to go back into the mines. They had a lot of trouble getting enough labor. So they tried to find an alternative to import under contracts. And they first tried to import from India, and that was actually a logical source because Indians had been going as contract workers to work on sugar plantations in a neighboring colony, the Natal. But because Indians had started to settle in South Africa right after they finished their contracts, the white South Africans didn't want them to stick around. They wanted to make them go back to India after their contracts were up. And India said no. So then they went to China. But they considered Europeans like Italians, and they said no, they're too expensive. They considered African Americans, and they said no, they're not only too expensive, but they'll teach the natives bad ideas. So they end up in China. And one of the people who actually helps organize the program is Herbert Hoover, who is the future president of the United States. He's a mining engineer, and he worked in China, and he had contacts there and in South Africa and in London. So he's a minor figure that shows up in my book, who helped set up the recruitment agencies of Chinese workers.
Wow, it is it's an amazing story. It's also amazing when you can actually, see them thinking aloud about what characteristics they want in a workforce.
Right.
Yeah, because people don't always put that down in paper, but in the 19th century, they were a little bit more willing to write it down.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like one of the commonalities in these different sites is imagining that these Chinese would be temporary, right? That in our more recent parlance would be guest workers of some sort. Like, it's okay if they come and do these certain projects that we need, but we really, they're not part of the future. Is that true, that that's a commonality? I'm just curious about, so we've talked about how they were excluded, what their lives were like. I'm just also interested in sort of what commonalities you see on their, what spurs their migration. Why do we see the Chinese diaspora in these different locations?
Well, people went to the gold rushes from all over the world, so that included China. And Chinese had been emigrating from southern China in particular for many years, but until the 19th century, mostly were local, right? Went to Southeast Asia sites, both as traders and as workers. And it's only in the mid 19th century that Chinese really embark on long distance migration, starting with labor migration. So there's indentured migration to the Caribbean, to the plantation colonies after the abolition of slavery. And Chinese go to Cuba, they go to Peru and some of the British colonies, along with Indian workers who are a far outnumber the Chinese in terms of this indentured or so-called coulee trade. And then you have Chinese who go to what I call the West, right, which is more of a concept than an actual place, right? They go to the settler colonies, right? And I include the United States as a settler nation. They go because of the gold, because that's where the gold rushes are. They're in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, North America, United States. And so in a sense, they are like all the other gold seekers who come from all over the world. They're seeking opportunity. Some of them are, come from families of modest means, and they're like all migrants, they're looking for a chance to better their lives. But the gold rush is a kind of special moment where there's a fever, right? They call it gold fever. And so a lot of people go, and, some of it is adventure, ambition, but also connected to a desire for economic improvement. And they're not, the question is, are they temporary? That's a really interesting question, because on the gold fields, at one level, everybody was seen as temporary, or they saw themselves as temporary. They were going to make their pile, as they said, I'll make my pile and then I'll go home. So that was true of miners from everywhere, including miners from, say, Boston, right? They were going to go make their pile in California and go back to Boston. So in that sense, everybody was kind of temporary. And then as the gold fields kind of settled down a little, then there's a question, well, who's going to stay? I mean, because not everybody stays either. I mean, there are people I call serial rushers. They go to the next rush, right? So people from California then go to Australia, and then some of them go to New Zealand. You know, they never settle down. But there are people who do settle down. And then the question is, who's going to decide what kind of society this is going to be? Because you have people from all over the world. Who's going to decide by what means, right? Who's going to get the vote, right? So then you have politics come into play and questions of difference or you know, capacity for assimilation, and these questions start to get debated.
Yeah. And so this is a different kind of question, but one thing that strikes me about this book is that it's published with Norton, which maybe our listeners don't know, but that is an unusual thing in that this is, you know, a major trade press. It's been a long time. It's been publishing American history books to a wide readership, but it has not published Asian American history in general. And so how did that come about? Was it challenging? You know, how do you think about sort of this moment where I feel like this is in some ways perhaps an under-recognized breakthrough to publish with a press like Norton? To me, I read it as a recognition that Asian American history is like within their US history focus. I was curious about that publishing.
Oh, okay. Well, you know, I wanted to publish with a trade press because I wanted to have a broader audience. And that's a challenge because I didn't want to, you know, I didn't want to dumb down, you know, my argument or what I was saying, but I also had to write a narrative that, you know, is not a dense academic work with a lot of jargon and, you know, footnotes and stuff like that. So, so my second book was also a trade book, The Lucky Ones. So I had a little experience writing in that kind of genre. So when, you know, I have a literary agent, and when we took it out, there was interest in a number of trade presses. You know, Norton wasn't the only one, but I appreciated. I had a great editor there who was very sensitive to what I was trying to do. I think he understood it. He helped me make it a better book. And I think that, you know, I mean, I started the process with them, you know, maybe 3 years ago or more. You know, it takes a long time to finish a book. Nowadays, I think many of the presses are more interested. You know, Norton just published a book about Vincent Chin for a young adult audience, because that's now the big thing in publishing, is the young adult market. I just learned this. I didn't know this, but Norton, as part of Norton's first year of young adult publishing, they published a very nice book about Vincent Chin and the movement against racial violence. So I think, you know, hopefully there will be, you know, there's others who've published trade books on Asian American history. So hopefully we'll see more, you know. Your next book, Beth.
Not my next book, but maybe others. I'm cheering others on. So I guess the other thing I wanted to ask, sort of more in the contemporary zone, is to ask about how you're thinking about anti-Asian hate today, you know, in the 21st century. And I think, you know, since your expertise is in history, and since this book is in the 19th century, I was curious if you draw particular lessons for today.
Right. Well, thank you for asking about that. You know, as I was saying earlier, you know, racism is always, you know, historically and politically specific. So I think that today's racism against Chinese and Asians, on the one hand, draws from this very long history of racism and racial stereotypes. they never really completely went away. On the other hand, they're reproduced in today's world. So take, for example, so it's always about China, right? It's always about how people in the West look at China. And then depending on how they look at China is how it comes back to us, right? So, so in the 19th century, China was, for all intents and purposes, well, not all intents and purposes, but to a large extent was colonized by the West and was forced during the Opium Wars into an international community in a situation of great inequality. And I argue in my book that the Chinese question was part of a larger strategy to isolate China, to keep China marginal to the globalization of the international economy that was taking place. So that required not only to keep Chinese people out of Western countries, but also to contain China's trade and economic development. So today, China is in a very different position, as we all know. It's an economic and geopolitical superpower. And so there's tremendous anxiety and competition in the West about China's rise as a global economic power. The United States is still the largest economy in the world, but China's number 2. And I think, unfortunately, for everybody in the world, both China and the United States are approach this as a zero-sum game and with intense nationalistic rhetoric and competition. So I was actually surprised that President Biden has continued Trump's China policy, right? Trump overturned several administrations' policy of what they called engagement, constructive engagement with China, which is a recognition of China as both a competitor and somebody with whom we are deeply, imbricated, right? It's both competition and dependency, interdependency. Trump overturned that policy and declared China to be a strategic adversary and, threatened trade wars, tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. And Biden continues that. Biden continues to consider China a strategic adversary. So it's interesting because Biden has been very firm about opposing violence and racism towards Asian Americans. So he's kind of talking out of two sides of his mouth, right? I mean, I appreciate his stand against racism, but he doesn't seem to connect the dots and realize that as long as he considers China a strategic adversary, Asian Americans are going to feel that effect. Now, and I don't take one side or the other. I don't support Xi Jinping's ultranationalism either, right? So I think both sides have embarked on a path that is not constructive for the people of either country or for the world. So, but getting back to the racism, you can see the coulee, the figure of the coulee, reemerge in our own time. Who's the coulee? Who are the coolies today? I think there are two kinds of coolies today. One is the factory worker in China in the special economic zones, right? We read stories about workers that work in a Shenzhen or in, for Foxconn, they work 80, 100 hours a week. They have no rights. They're like little robots, right? And they're terribly oppressed. And it's unfair competition, right? Because they're paid such cheap wages. And they work very long hours. And the other coulee are on our campuses. They're the Chinese American and Chinese international students and Asian American students who are like coolies. Why? Because they study too hard. All they do is study. They don't have any fun. And so they're another kind of unfair competition because they're not like normal American kids, right? They're abnormal. It's pathological. So, and they're all, under some despotic master, whether it's the Communist Party in China or their tiger mothers in America. So we have this coulee trope kind of repurposed, but all the triggers are there, right? You work too hard, paid too little, robots, under the whip of masters, they don't have any individuality, and all those stereotypes about coolies are triggered, and nobody even thinks twice about it. So I think that the coolie myth is proven to be very durable, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Well,
Unfortunately.
I want to hand this over to Herb and Q&A, answering audience questions, but I'll just point out one thing that I think was striking about your answer is you didn't mention the pandemic, which I'm not faulting.
Oh yeah, right.
But I'm bringing it out because it's interesting. It suggests that although we like to think that the pandemic is settling down or ending in some way, the sort of phenomenon that you're describing do not have any clear end or high point.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic obviously made everything worse with Trump's blaming, the virus on China. That's true. But I don't know if that's what's fueling things now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, I think that's a sobering thought, because I think it's almost always narrated as a pandemic phenomenon. And then people hope that it will end with an end, hopefully, of the pandemic. Okay, but with that, I want to hand it over to make sure we have questions from the audience.
Yeah, we do have several questions, so I'll just get right into it. Jeffrey Tao asks, the white Australian policy started in 1901 and didn't end until 1966. So why do you think it persisted for so long? Does this historical hostility toward Chinese and other Asians partly explain the exacerbated relations between Australia and China? What do you think about that?
I think we Americans are kind of astonished when we hear that a country actually has a white policy. I mean, you could say the United States has a white United States policy, but people won't say it, right? People won't say it because we had a civil war against racism. So there's some things you can't say still, even in America. But in Australia, white Australia was very much about distinguishing themselves from Asia, because they were, as I said earlier, at the very fringes of the British Empire in Asia, and they wanted to make sure Australia stayed white. So it did persist for a very long time. And I actually think it went into the 70s, not 1960s, but I don't know the exact date. So, and so interestingly, Australia moved away from the white Australia policy in the late 20th century because it decided it wanted to be part of Asia, right? They staked their economic future on being an Asian economic power. And who is Australia's biggest trading partner today? It's China. So Australia, so where goes Australia and China? There goes their race policy. There's a lot of tension though in Australia. I mean, there's a lot of Chinese immigration in Australia. Sydney in particular has a huge Chinese population, but other cities have big Chinese populations. And there's a lot of tension. It's not dissimilar to what you see in the United States. There's a lot of complaint about the Chinese in cities like Sydney, like they drive up real estate prices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And many of them they're not workers. They are, I think, when Hong Kong was returned to China, a lot of Hong Kongers with means moved to Australia. There are a lot of wealthy Chinese in Australia. So it's still an issue. I think the racial tensions there are still an issue.
Thanks for that, Mae. And just to kind of clarify, what is the white Australian policy? Was it in response to Chinese presence directly, and what did it do actually?
So in the late 19th century, so until 1901, which is when there was a federation, Australia was a series of separate colonies. And so, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, et cetera, et cetera. And so the Chinese question had a different iteration in each of those colonies. It wasn't always the same, but there was a lot of opposition to the Chinese, as I mentioned earlier, starting in the 1880s and 1890s. And so there was more and more agitation to restrict the Chinese from coming or to exclude them altogether. And this phrase, "we want a white Australia," became, I guess it was the equivalent of the Chinese must go, right? That's the mass slogan in California. In Australia, the mass slogan was white Australia. And white Australians, both elites and ordinary white people, talked about Australia is a white man's country. And they were very explicit about that. We are a white man's country, not even white women, right? It's a white man's country. So the White Australia policy was enacted upon federation when they joined together as a dominion of the British Empire. So the dominions like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Canada are considered to have maximum autonomy within the British Empire. So they still have the protection of the empire in terms of military protection, but they have maximum autonomy. And so all of these settler colonies were driven by the desire to be white men's countries, and they are not in areas in the world where white people are majority, right? South Africa being the most blatant example, but they all envision themselves as white men's countries. And you could say the same thing was true in the United States, that the people who settled the West thought the West was for whites, and after the Civil War, there was a fork in the road, right? Was America going to be a country based on white supremacy or based on democracy, right? And we know which road America took. So anyway, so I think, so that's the White Australia policy. So it was a number of laws that were passed upon federation. First was an immigration law. And it was actually it was differently written than in the United States. A person had to take a language test in a European language, a dictation test. And in any European language. So then you might have a Chinese from Hong Kong come and they could speak English. So they would give them the test in German, right? So it was meant to exclude Asians, both Chinese and South Asians. And they passed other laws under the White Australia policy. They disenfranchised all Aboriginal people. They denied them the vote. And they deported people from the Melanesian islands who were working in Australia as contract workers. So it was a very deliberate kind of racial cleansing policy.
Great, thank you for that. Next, Ernest Lee, his question is, the two of your books are centered on the West Coast. Are you also writing about Chinese families and situations on the East Coast? Yeah, what's your response to?
No, my next book is more of a political and intellectual history about liberal narratives of inclusion. I am working on a book. I'm writing part of a book about that's going to have Corky Lee's photographs. It's a retrospective of Corky Lee's 50 years of photography, and I'm working on the introduction to that book. So that's more East Coast, but it's also national.
Great. And next, Kalena Gregory, she asks, I know you couldn't research every country that the Chinese went to, but did you find out anything about the Chinese going to the very small gold rush and or kauri gum gathering industry in New Zealand? Did you come upon any resources about that?
I read a few books, but I really was not able to learn enough to really be able to speak authoritatively. I mean, New Zealand has a different history than Australia because it has a different relationship to its indigenous population, but they also passed the Chinese, exclusion laws. So, once it kind of becomes this thing, it's spread throughout British colonies.
And Milton Ng, he was surprised to learn that the Chinese fought in the Civil War. I'm not sure if you learned that through your book or what other book, but could you discuss this a little bit? How did they get there, and which side did they join, and why? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about that. I think that there were Chinese who fought in the Civil War. I think they mostly came from not California, but from the East Coast or the Middle West, where there were small Chinese populations and even American-born Chinese. So I'm sorry, that's not an area that I've really done much research on. Beth, do you have any insight to this question?
I mean, I think there's very small numbers that we find on both sides. I mean, one of the most famous cases is the men known as the Siamese twins, Chang and Eng.
Oh, right.
Sent their sons to fight on behalf of the Confederacy. So, I think we have like little glimpses that gives us a sense of, the Chinese being involved in this, central moment in American history, but only sort of on the edges.
Right. And next question is from Pauline Ho Bynum, who asks, would you comment on the Chinese foreign students at American universities in the late 19th century and 20th century, many of whom returned to China with the mission to modernize China? Yeah, just interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, there were, I don't know, several thousand Chinese students who came to study in the United States. Especially after the second Boxer indemnity, there were scholarships that were set up. So yes, many of them came to study in the sciences or technologies, and with the intention to go back to China to modernize. I mean, some of them, it varies, right? In the late 19th century, is different than, say, like in the 19-teens and 20s, when there are larger numbers of students who come. One thing that I learned recently from a graduate student of mine who's researching the formation of the China Foundation. The China Foundation was formed with Boxer indemnity monies to promote the advancement of scientific study in China. And it was associated with the founding of Tsinghua University, which was done on an American model. And one of the interesting things, my student, her name is Cheng Ji-Xing, one of the interesting things she found was that there was a lot of debate over how the Boxer indemnity should be spent. And they finally, came to the decision that it should promote the advancement of scientific education. But the interesting thing was that there was also a debate about what kind of science they should be promoting. And some people wanted more applied sciences like engineering, agricultural technologies, this kind of thing, because they thought this would be help China the fastest, right, with very practical knowledges. And others, some Americans, but a lot of the Chinese said, no, we have to study basic science. We have to study pure science, because that is the foundation for all scientific knowledge. And if we only study the applied fields, they didn't say it in so many words, but they were basically saying we'll still be under the power of the West. And first of all, how do you even know that American agricultural science will work in China? You don't know enough about China. And China actually has a long agricultural tradition. So they fought very hard for China to study basic science. And I think it was a kind of nationalist position, right? That they could only really have institutional and national autonomy if they built their science on the foundation of pure science. So these are really interesting. There's a lot we have to learn, as our students and our colleagues do more research into these questions. It's really fascinating, I think, about, I mean, we kind of have this general idea about the Boxer scholarships, but there's a lot more we can know about it. And then there were people like Hu Shi who said, I don't want to study science. I want to study literature and philosophy. And, we need that too. So anyway, that's my little story about the Boxer and 10 minutes.
Great, thank you for that. I want to ask one final question, and it's about the book and what you might have uncovered about Chinese women during the period that you were studying. I know that there may not have been a lot of Chinese women, but did you find any that were working actually on claims, or what was their presence like, in all these different gold rushes?
No, sadly, I found no Chinese women in the gold rushes. There are very few women who go to the gold rushes, period, regardless of their country of origin. There were Chinese women who went to the cities during the gold rush as the wives of merchants, sometimes the wives of laborers, because the gold rush is before the exclusion laws. So there were women who came with either merchant husbands or laborers. And there were also women who came as sex workers. That is also kind of the structure of female migration to the gold fields and other ethnic groups as well, right? Wives of merchants, sex workers, entertainers, that kind of thing. In some towns, later in the 19th century, and some of this is, you can read in Beth's book, where Chinese communities form. There are women, there are families, but the Page Law and the exclusion laws are very harsh against Chinese female immigration. And Chinese women, I mean, many Chinese wives didn't want to immigrate. It was partly because the laws were so harsh against them, but it was also because it was, the general custom for the wife to stay in the home of her in-laws. And that was a kind of, claim on the sojourner that he would return. So part of it's legal and part of it's cultural.
Well, Mae and Beth, thank you so much for this really fascinating discussion. And, I know there's a lot more to say and a lot more to explore, but I think we'll leave it there. Just to remind everybody to get this amazing book.
Yes, buy the book.
Yes, I'm savoring every word still. And also go ahead and pick up Mae and Beth's, all their books. I think, as we've done at the museum, we've been learning a lot, and you can learn a lot from both of their research. So again, thank you, Mae and Beth. Thank you all for tuning in. We have a lot more programming coming up in the spring, and check back on our website to find out all about it and our exhibition responses. Asian American Voices, Resisting the Tides of Racism closes on March 27th. So there's still some time to come check it out. Okay, so thank you again.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, MOCA. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Good night.